Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another your AP US History podcast. We're going live with the foreign policy in the progressive era. That's right. This is one of those super specific topics that I'm going to try to help you to better understand. It's a little dry, but bear with me here. Your notes are going to start with this nice long list of terms that you want to be thinking about. What we should remember from the Spanish-American War is that we're coming into the 1900s with this time with the new American empire. If it's an empire, if you can call it that, it's mostly in the Pacific, but you can also see a little bit over there in Central America, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and so on and so forth. But you do have this nice long list of terms, and you really do, for the sake of the AP exam, want to be able to recognize all of these. So make sure that you look back over these at the end of our lecture. But let's just dive right in, and we're going to start with China and the famous open door policy. I'd like to point out that this sort of begins in 1885. A lot of textbooks will give America credit for the open door policy concept, but it really comes out of the European slicing up of Africa, in particular the Congo. The Congo was known as the Congo Free State. The Belgians were supposed to follow this open door policy in the Congo Basin, meaning that all Europeans could come and trade there. But of course the Belgians controlled it, dominated it, and they also raped and pillaged the Congo. You see the picture of the sliced off hands, millions and millions of people killed in what was a total genocide. And remember too that this is the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1887 and total American fear. We called it the yellow peril of Asian immigrants. So you see some images from our press at the time, the exclusion fence, the Asian there portrayed as some kind of an evil monster, devil-like figure. This was another kind of famous one that summed it up. On the left, why they can live on 40 cents a day. On the right, why they can't. The American family worker needs his good salary, when of course the Chinese living almost like animals here on the left, from a popular newspaper at the time. But let's get into that open door policy. 1899, Secretary of State John Hay, that's Mr. Splendid Little War from the Spanish-American War, was looking at the situation in Asia and really wanted to have an informal role where America would be dominant at keeping China from being split up by all the European powers. So we start to develop the concept. And in the midst of the development, we have what's known as the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this rebellion, but it had to do with this super patriotic nationalism, resenting foreign takeovers. It was violent and bloody. It was a rare example of a multinational force, many different nations coming together, including the U.S. We were quite angry, we being the multinational force, quite angry at the Chinese. They were punished to the tune of a $300 million indemnity, although I'm happy to report that the U.S., when they got $25 million, they gave $18 million of it back in the form of scholarships for Chinese to come to America. So we didn't have as much of the European vindictiveness that we saw at the time. So that brings us into the open door. Hay announces the open door policy, and the philosophy is that all nations will have equal access to trade in China, but that we'll be the ones guarding the gate. We'll be the enforcing power so that nobody splits it up, so that China's not going to look like Africa. And it really, in some ways, came close to it. You can see France, Britain, Germany, Japan, Russia all fighting over influencing China. But instead of being parceled up and balkanized, as they say, we end up following this open door policy. And when you've got the door open with Uncle Sam in front of the door, there's a definite idea of the U.S. prestige and the U.S. role at that open door. And so we see a few other cartoons kind of showing this idea of the trade, all the stuff coming out of China or coming into China, as the case may be. So that's the basic concept of the open door policy. This is a little political cartoon of the election of 1900. You'll notice it's McKinley and Roosevelt running again. And they compare on one side, had you gone Democratic, the factories are empty. You gone Republican, everything's working well, farming, factories, growth. A run on the bank on the left, a reminder of the panic of the late 1800s. A run to the bank on the right, showing people just, nicely going to the bank. Spanish rule and the horror in Cuba, and then American rule and the happiness in Cuba, right? The American flag has been planted for humanity's sake is the idea that's being represented here. And running against William Jennings Bryan. That's something of a repeat election, and we know that the result, that was 96. Here we see 1900. It's almost identical. We can go back and forth on that just once so you can get the idea. McKinley and Roosevelt win. Roosevelt's the new vice president and famously the guy who, Hanna, who helped pay for this election, was not a fan of Roosevelt. He said, that damn cowboy is just a heartbeat away from the presidency. And he was right, because what happens a few months later is this fellow, Leon Czolgosz, assassinates McKinley. There he is in his little cage about to be tried. And Teddy Roosevelt is our new president. Teddy. Teddy is an interesting figure. He was famous for his tennis cabinet. It was his sports and hunting friends that were his unofficial advisors. It was kind of like the kitchen cabinet that Andrew Jackson had had in the past. He was famous for being an adventurer, an outdoorsman, something of an egoist, something of a cowboy. There's this very famous picture of him riding on the moose, although I will point out, if you look closely at it, you can see that even in the 1900s, they knew how to Photoshop. And he was photoshopped onto that moose. He was not, in fact, riding on that moose, although he did, in fact, kill this elephant. He was quite a guy, Teddy Roosevelt. He's one of the few people who has been known to have been shot in the middle of running for president. While he was campaigning, he continued to give his campaign speech and even showed off the blood on his shirt there. In fact, it probably would have killed him if it hadn't been for his 65-page speech, which you can see on the left here, which stopped the bullet and kept him alive. But he did die with that bullet lodged between his ribs, carried it for the rest of his life. Teddy is famous for being the walked softly and carry a big stick president, and that's the new approach to foreign policy he's going to bring. This is one of my favorite political cartoons. Shows him walking around what they called the Yankee Lake. The Caribbean was really a place for America to show its dominance under Roosevelt. And this begins with Panama. So we'll explain Panama briefly and what happens. It's similar to the Hawaii story. This is probably distracting. But the Panama story is Roosevelt really wants there to be a canal, right? And he wants to be the president that makes it. But we had a problem. Since 1850, we had a treaty with the United Kingdom called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which said that nobody would build a canal and own it. It was essentially neutrality to Central America. And it wasn't until we had a new treaty, the Hay-Ponsforty Treaty of 1901, that we were kind of allowed to move forward and do this new plan. We could create and we could control a canal. The original idea was to put it through Nicaragua. And so here you can see these red lines. There's a giant lake in Nicaragua that was going to make it not as long as it seems. It seemed like an easier plan, an easier project. Problem was, Teddy was impatient, really. And if you look down there at Panama, it's much shorter, right? But there was a problem with Panama. We didn't have permission. We didn't own Panama. And Panama, in fact, didn't own Panama, right? And there was already a plan in the process. A French guy, a fairly interesting character named Philippe Bunau-Varille, was working on this project of building this canal. And we realized that we needed, in fact, to own Panama if this was going to work. But who did own Panama? This is the question, right? Panama was owned by Colombia. If you look at this old map on the left, you see here United States of Colombia, and Panama was a part of it. It went all the way basically to Costa Rica. Congress approved a plan where we offered $10 million and an annual payment forever of $250,000 to Colombia if we could have this 6-mile strip. And Colombia refused. Teddy Roosevelt was not a happy man. He was famous for having said, "Damn the law, I want my canal." But he wasn't ready to just send in the troops and take Panama. Luckily, he didn't have to, because Philippe Bunau-Varille decided to do it for us. He organized a very small group of gentlemen, mostly the Panamanian Fire Department. He hired 500 mercenaries, and they staged an uprising against Colombia. And what you don't see on the map there is a little place called the Darien Gap. There's a very dense forest, so you pretty much have to sail from Cartagena, Colombia, into Panama. And it was going to take the Colombians a few days before they could come and get the Panamanians and take their region back. But before they did that, the United States Navy sailed in and said, "We recognize the new nation of Panama, and conveniently they're going to give us this strip of land in perpetuity." And so that's how we got the land that is the canal, although we later gave it back. And that's the story of the Panama Canal, essentially. Just a couple of pictures to show you how it works. It's a pretty cool deal. It was really amazing engineering for that time period. You see the Pacific on one side, the Atlantic on the other, and you can see that it's almost 100 feet where you had to raise the water levels and lower the water levels. So you've got all these locks, and it's a really cool process. Some great shots of Teddy Roosevelt manning the big crane as they're trying to build this thing. And again, just seeing how Panama was created and looking at some cruise ships and shipping ships that are going through the canal. It's a pretty cool place. This brings us to the idea of what became known as cowboy diplomacy. Teddy gets a bad reputation. The United States gets kind of a bad reputation in Central America as being a bit of a bully. Some called it the rape of Panama or the rape of Colombia. We just took what we wanted because we needed it. Teddy talked about this idea known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He didn't want to create his own new doctrine, so he thought he would just add on to the famous Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically said to Europe, thou shalt not intervene, right? Well, Teddy came along and said, we're going to intervene to keep you from intervening, because we're not going to allow that to happen. And so this is a great cartoon showing that, where Teddy comes in with his big gunboat and he's telling the European powers, stay out of our hemisphere. But Teddy wasn't all big stick. Well, this is the famous quote where he talks about how we will become the world's police power. Sometimes people like to ask, why does America have to be the world's police power? Well, Teddy Roosevelt was announcing to the world in the 1900s that we were ready to be the world's police power. Perhaps now we're not. That's okay, but this is where it came from. Teddy also got really involved in diplomacy, not just in Central America, but all over the world. Here's a couple of cartoons that are talking about the situation of the United States becoming a new imperial power. So you see the American trying to explain to Cuba and Puerto Rico and others, the so-called savages, soap. Have you used it? Teddy Roosevelt bragging that we're going to be the policemen of the world. Here he is. This is what I was getting at. 1905, Teddy Roosevelt wins the Nobel Peace Prize for helping negotiate peace between Russia and Japan. That was kind of a highlight moment for Teddy. We are good fighters, but now we're ready to fight for peace in his typical Teddy style. And he does get the Peace Prize for that one. Pretty sweet. Good deal. Let's talk Japan. Japan is opened up to the west famously by Commodore Perry. There he is, a picture of him on the right, and the Japanese portrayal of him on the left. He sails into Japan with a huge fleet of naval ships, and sort of under the force of intimidation, manages to force a trade agreement known as the Treaty of Kanagawa, 1854, opening up peace and friendship between the United States and Japan, also making sort of deals about trade and assistance and things like that you'll find in your notes. There's the American fleet. It's an impressive fleet. You can watch it sailing in. This is a Japanese portrayal of that moment. This will continue on. We will relate this to some American political issues at the time, Japanese migration issues. The Japanese didn't really even come to America until the 1880s, and then there was a huge upsurge after Chinese were forbidden from coming, but it was the same kind of racism in America, the yellow peril, this new fear. There was not as many as people made it out to be, but it was a significant in the eyes of the Americans. But we go to the Taft-Katsura Agreement. In 1904, because we wanted to keep our Hawaii and our Philippines, and we saw that Japan was on the rise, we kind of made a deal with the Japanese where they would let us keep Hawaii and the Philippines, and we would sort of turn a blind eye while they took over Korea, even though we had promised in the famous 1883 American-Korean Treaty that we weren't going to let that happen. So this was a little bit problematic, but we'll get into that one a little bit later. We do have the 1906 showdown in California. The schools segregated. They put Japanese kids in one set of schools and white kids in another set of schools, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. And this led to a lot of offended Asian nations and a lot of problems. And so Teddy ends up signing the famous Gentleman's Agreement. So instead of keeping the Japanese out like we did with the Chinese, the Japanese agreed just not to come anymore. Next thing that happens, the Great White Fleet. 1907, we send 16 naval destroyers. Just to follow up on that, Commodore Perry, we're going to show our new power with the new Navy. And you can see in this picture, it's an impressive sight as they come sailing in, steaming in really, with these ships. And we're going to make a new agreement, the Root-Takahira Agreement, this idea that the Japanese are going to avoid war with us. We're going to kind of stall and have another temporary peace while Japan expands its empire at the cost of a lot of other peoples across Asia. Just a little picture of the signing of this famous treaty. Just a few more things to go, and then we'll be done here. Taft becomes president after Roosevelt, and he's famous for shifting from the big stick policy to the dollar diplomacy policy. He's going to bring financial opportunities and try to use the power of the purse and money. The two big places where we'll see that are going to be in China and in the Caribbean, which again was referred to as that Yankee Lake. It didn't work as well as Taft was hoping it would in Manchuria. He was trying to keep the Japanese and the Russians from fighting over the railroads in China, but they were not interested. They wanted to fight over what they were going to get over there. We will go from Taft there's not as much to really remember about Taft. We have the infamous election of 1912, where Roosevelt decides that he doesn't like Taft being the Republican candidate, and so he's going to run too, but Taft gets picked by the Republicans, so Roosevelt runs his own party, the Bull Moose Party, against Wilson. And when you divide, this is a famous equation, an elephant divided by a moose equals a donkey. And that's how Woodrow Wilson becomes the next, or only the second Democratic president in America since the Civil War. Another picture kind of showing this issue. Here's the election results. That's 1908, sorry. Here's 1912. You also have the third-party candidate, Eugene Debs, getting involved, running as a socialist and getting over 1 million votes, which is fairly impressive considering the Red Scare of the time. You see here the results, right? The Republicans do terrible. They only get 2 states. Teddy Roosevelt's personal popularity manages to carry 5 or 6 states, and then Wilson just sweeps the nation into the White House. The professor, Princeton, head of Princeton, brings in the first really anti-imperialist mentality, although he'll change that around in some degree when we move into World War I, but we'll talk about that later. He will attack dollar diplomacy. He's going to attack special interests. He's going to be all over the place. He's going to claim to reduce our interventions around the world, but when you look at this great map of interventions in Central America, you can just see that they're all over the place and they're happening in every time period under every president. So the reality is, even though he attacks the idea of the big stick, he goes right back into the big stick. Wilson sends troops to Haiti, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, and the Virgin Islands. If that's not a big stick, I don't know what is. We also get involved in Mexico with his so-called moral diplomacy. Here's Wilson lecturing to the little children of Central America, Mexico, Venezuela, Nicaragua, so on and so forth, trying to explain to them what democracy is supposed to be. We're going to be the conscience of the world. We're going to spread democracy and peace and freedom and condemn colonialism. When we've got Wilson in the presidency, we have Henry Cabot Lodge in Congress, who throws his Lodge corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where he basically says that non-European powers, like Japan, they also should be excluded from the Western Hemisphere. All right, one final topic, and then we're done. Mexico. Mexico is just torn by violence and a revolution that starts in 1913. The U.S., of course, is going to play a pretty specific role. When Huerta seizes control of Mexico, things really fall apart, and you've got Carranza and the famous Pancho Villa and Zapata and all these different fellows fighting. The U.S. gets involved, and we end up occupying Veracruz. Our Navy can land there quite easily. Huerta flees Mexico. We decide to side with Carranza, who then turns on Pancho Villa and Zapata and his Zapatistas, and this leads to all kinds of trouble. Pancho Villa, in fact, is so mad. Here he is before he's mad at us. Here he's friends with General John Pershing. Villa then leads an attack into the United States on American soil. In 1916, the town of Columbus, New Mexico, is attacked. Some 80 people are killed. It was a big mess. They burned half the city to the ground. And so the U.S. Army goes after Pancho Villa and will traipse across on this famous, you can see Uncle Sam jumping across the fence, going after Pancho Villa on this famous U.S. Army incursion, the hunt for Pancho Villa. For almost 2 years, the U.S. Army, led by Pershing, on the punitive expedition, going all across Mexico. And somewhat embarrassingly, we couldn't seem to find Pancho Villa. Somebody else will kill him and do that for us. We were all over the place fighting different battles, trying to find this guy, Pancho Villa. You've ever seen the movie Pancho Villa starring as himself with Antonio Banderas? Fun film. You can learn a little bit about Pancho Villa through that. That sums up our lecture for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. Bye.